Something has quietly changed about living in America. Not in a way that makes headlines, not in a way that feels dramatic. Life didn't collapse. It became tighter, more expensive, and far less forgiving. Jobs still exist. Money still moves. The system still works on paper, but for millions of people, it no longer works in real life. And the most dangerous part isn't that people are struggling. It's that they're slowly adapting to struggle as normal. Living in America did not suddenly become impossible. That is what makes the change so difficult to describe. There was no single collapse, no defining moment when everything broke, no headline that captured it cleanly. Instead, life became quietly harder, more expensive, more fragile, and more demanding in ways that accumulate slowly. You still wake up, you still go to work, you still pay bills, but every step now carries more resistance than it used to. What people are experiencing is not chaos, it is compression. Ordinary life has been squeezed so tightly that even small disruptions feel dangerous. A missed paycheck, a medical bill, a car repair. Events that once created stress now create lasting damage. Not because people became irresponsible, but because the margin for error disappeared. That margin used to be the difference between stress and stability. It's gone. Work still exists everywhere. Job listings are full. Businesses are open. The economy continues to move. But employment no longer functions as protection. A paycheck covers less than it used to, and it arrives attached to conditions that feel temporary. Hours change without warning. Benefits shrink quietly. Contracts end. Raises lag behind costs. People work just as hard, often harder, yet feel further behind every year. This creates a psychological shift that statistics fail to capture. When effort stops producing security, people don't stop working. They stop trusting the process. They stop believing that doing the right things will lead anywhere meaningful. And once that belief weakens, everything else begins to change. Food is often the first place people notice it, not because they are starving, but because grocery shopping becomes stressful in a way it never used to be. Prices don't simply rise. They fluctuate. Items disappear. Portions shrink. Brands stop mattering because choice narrows to what's affordable that week. People adapt quietly. They buy less protein, fewer fresh items, fewer extras. They don't describe this as hardship. They call it being smarter, cutting back, adjusting habits. But what's really happening is a downgrade of daily life. And once food becomes a calculation instead of a routine, the sense of security begins to unravel. Housing follows closely behind. Whether renting or owning, shelter no longer feels fixed. Rent increases arrive without warning. Mortgages reset. Property taxes rise. Insurance premiums spike. Repairs become financial threats. Instead of manageable upkeep, even homeowners feel temporary now. Not because they plan to leave, but because staying requires constant vigilance. Housing is no longer a foundation. It's a variable. For renters, permanence barely exists at all. Every lease renewal feels like a test. Every year carries the risk of displacement. People stop decorating the same way. They stop investing emotionally. They stop planning long-term. When housing stops feeling stable, people stop building lives around place. Communities weaken long before anyone moves out. Healthcare adds another layer of uncertainty. Insurance is expensive, confusing, and unreliable. Coverage exists on paper, but costs remain unpredictable. A single visit can lead to months of bills, disputes, and stress. So people delay care. They skip checkups. They ignore symptoms, not because they don't value health, but because interacting with the system feels risky. Healthcare becomes something you brace for, not something you trust. Transportation, utilities, and basic services follow the same pattern. Gas prices swing, electricity bills fluctuate, Water, internet, and phone costs creep upward. Each expense alone feels manageable. Together, they form a constant drain. Nothing collapses, nothing explodes. Life just becomes heavier. Wages don't collapse either. And that's part of the illusion. Income still arrives, but it doesn't stretch. Raises feel symbolic. Promotions don't change outcomes. Overtime fills gaps temporarily, but never creates breathing room. The result is a strange kind of stasis. People work continuously just to remain in place. Progress feels theoretical. Stability feels conditional. Debt fills the gap. Credit cards are no longer used for indulgence. They cover groceries, utilities, medical expenses, and rent shortfalls. Buy now, pay later plans replace savings. Payment schedules become permanent instead of temporary. Debt stops feeling like a bridge to the future. It becomes part of the present. And when survival depends on debt, anxiety becomes constant. People stop asking how to get ahead. They ask how long they can hold on. This pressure reshapes behavior quietly. People stop planning years ahead. They stop imagining upgrades. They stop setting ambitious goals. Long-term thinking begins to feel irresponsible when short-term survival is uncertain. Life becomes tactical. People measure months, not decades. Relationships feel the strain as well. Financial pressure doesn't stay confined to bank accounts. It enters conversations, decisions, and expectations. Socializing becomes expensive. Family plans are delayed. Commitments feel risky. People withdraw. Not because they don't care, but because caring costs energy they no longer have. Communities thin out emotionally before they thin out physically. Education, once framed as the guaranteed escape route, no longer feels reliable. Degrees are expensive. Debt lingers. Outcomes feel uncertain. People still value learning, but the promise attached to it feels broken. This doesn't create rebellion. It creates caution. People choose safer paths, smaller dreams, lower expectations, not because they lack ambition, but because the system has punished optimism too many times. What's most unsettling isn't anger. It's quiet adaptation. People aren't storming institutions. They're adjusting around them. They shrink lifestyles, delay milestones, internalize pressure. This creates a society that looks functional on the surface, but operates in survival mode underneath. The system still works, technically. Bills get paid, markets move, jobs exist, but the cost of participation keeps rising, while the reward keeps shrinking. That imbalance is the core of the new reality. It's why so many people feel like they're doing everything right, yet moving nowhere. This is not a temporary squeeze. It's a structural shift, one where ordinary life requires more effort just to stand still, and where stability has become something you manage, not something you earn. And as this pressure builds, it doesn't just change spending habits. It begins to change how people think about the future itself. That is where this story goes next. When stability turns into risk. When pressure becomes constant, it doesn't just change spending, it changes time. The future begins to shrink. At first, this feels subtle. 5-year plans start to feel unrealistic. 10-year plans disappear entirely. People stop imagining where they'll be and start focusing on how to stay where they are. Stability becomes something you defend, not something you build toward. This shift quietly reshapes how people relate to work. Jobs stop feeling like pathways. They become transactions. You trade time and energy for income, but nothing more. Loyalty feels risky. Going above and beyond feels unnecessary. Extra effort no longer signals ambition. It signals exposure. People still perform. They still meet expectations. But emotionally, they step back. They no longer attach identity or purpose to work because the system has shown them how easily that attachment can be broken. Layoffs, restructurings, and sudden changes reinforce the lesson. It doesn't matter how skilled you are, how long you've been there, or how well the company is doing. Employment feels conditional. And conditions change without warning. So people adapt. They stop expecting protection from work. They stop expecting growth from loyalty. They stop expecting fairness from effort. This doesn't produce rebellion. It produces distance. Careers turn into sequences of jobs. Experience becomes fragmented. Progress becomes harder to measure. People stop climbing ladders and start hopping between platforms, hoping one of them will hold long enough. This erosion of long-term thinking doesn't stay confined to work. It spreads. Family decisions change. Commitments are delayed. Marriage feels financially risky. Children feel like a permanent cost in a world where income is unstable. People don't reject these milestones. They postpone them. Life becomes provisional. Apartments feel temporary. Jobs feel temporary. Cities feel temporary. Even relationships begin to feel subject to forces beyond personal control. That sense of impermanence drains emotional investment. People protect themselves by caring less deeply, planning less boldly, and expecting less from institutions, and eventually from each other. This isn't cynicism, it's survival behavior. Education reflects the same shift. Once framed as the guaranteed escape route, it now feels like a gamble with unclear odds. Tuition rises, debt lingers, outcomes vary wildly. People still value learning, but the promise attached to it feels fragile, so choices narrow. Cheaper options, shorter programs, practical credentials over expansive learning. Curiosity compresses into utility. Learning becomes transactional, not because people stopped wanting better lives, but because they stopped trusting the system to deliver them. Small businesses feel this change before anyone else. As households cut discretionary spending, local economies lose momentum. Fewer meals out, fewer impulse purchases, fewer risks taken. Shops don't close loudly, they close quietly. Services disappear, hours shrink. Familiar places fade without ceremony. Communities thin out not through mass exodus, but through slow retreat. The spaces that once created connection, cafes, local stores, gathering spots, struggle to survive in an environment where every dollar is weighed carefully. Life becomes more isolated, more home-centered, more inward. And when social life contracts, mental health follows. People rarely talk about this openly, but the strain shows up everywhere. Anxiety becomes normalized. Exhaustion becomes constant. Hope feels fragile. People feel like they're running without moving. The system doesn't overwhelm people all at once. It wears them down through repetition. Every month requires vigilance. Every bill demands attention. Every decision carries risk. There is no pause, no recovery period, no sense of catching up. This constant low-level stress rewires behavior. People become risk-averse. They avoid change, even when change might help. They stay in situations that aren't working because uncertainty feels more dangerous than stagnation. This creates a paradox. The system becomes harder to escape precisely because it has made escape feel unsafe. Debt reinforces the trap. Once debt becomes part of daily survival, options narrow. People can't afford breaks. They can't afford mistakes. They can't afford transitions. They keep moving forward because stopping isn't an option. But forward doesn't feel like progress. This is how a society keeps functioning without believing in itself. People comply, but they don't commit. They participate, but they don't trust. They survive, but they don't thrive. Institutions notice this behavior, but often misread it. Lower engagement is blamed on attitude. Lower productivity is blamed on motivation. Declining loyalty is framed as generational failure. But the cause isn't cultural, it's structural. When a system demands constant effort just to maintain basic stability, people naturally pull back emotionally. They conserve energy. They narrow focus. They reduce exposure. This isn't apathy, it's adaptation. And it creates a society that looks stable from the outside while feeling brittle on the inside. Trust erodes slowly. People trust employers less, landlords less, insurers less. Even long-standing institutions feel distant and unreliable. So people hedge everything. They keep backups. They assume disruption. They expect disappointment. This defensive posture becomes exhausting, but it also becomes normal. And once it becomes normal, it is extremely difficult to reverse. Because recovery isn't just about improving numbers, it's about restoring belief. And belief does not return automatically when conditions improve. It returns when people feel safe enough to imagine again. Right now, imagination feels risky. The future doesn't feel like a place you move toward. It feels like something you brace against. That is the deeper cost of this new reality. Not just higher prices or tighter budgets, but the quiet narrowing of possibility. People don't talk about this openly. They rarely name it, but they feel it every day in the way decisions are made. Expectations are lowered, and versions of life once considered normal are quietly abandoned. As this mindset spreads, the system becomes increasingly hollow. It still functions, but without enthusiasm, without optimism, without shared momentum. And that hollowing has consequences. Because when enough people stop believing that participation leads to progress, something fundamental shifts. The system keeps operating. But people begin to detach from it. And that detachment is not loud or dramatic. It is calm. It is rational. And it is spreading. Which brings us to the final stage of this story, where adaptation turns into something more permanent and where the cost of this new reality becomes impossible to ignore. By the time detachment becomes widespread, it no longer feels personal. It feels realistic. People stop describing their lives as stressful or unfair. They describe them as just how things are. Expectations adjust downward. Effort becomes strategic. Hope becomes conditional. This is how a society continues functioning while quietly lowering its standards for what life is supposed to feel like. The most dangerous part of this new reality isn't that people are struggling. It's that they're adapting to struggle as normal. Once that happens, pressure no longer triggers alarm. It becomes background noise. People stop asking whether something is fair or sustainable. They ask whether it's manageable. If it can be managed, it's accepted. Even if it's exhausting, even if it's shrinking their lives. This acceptance reshapes identity. People stop seeing themselves as builders of the future and start seeing themselves as managers of risk. Their intelligence shifts toward navigation instead of creation. Their energy is spent avoiding damage rather than pursuing growth. This is not a failure of character. It's a response to an environment that punishes vulnerability and rewards caution. Over time, this mindset alters how people relate to each other. Trust becomes transactional. Relationships are filtered through economic reality. Support systems thin out. Not because people don't care, but because everyone is stretched. People still want connection, but connection feels expensive. So they ration it. Circles get smaller. Obligations shrink. Dependence on others feels dangerous in a system where everyone is already near capacity. Community weakens, not through conflict, but through quiet withdrawal. As this continues, inequality expands in ways that statistics struggle to capture. Two people can earn similar incomes and live in the same city, yet experience completely different realities depending on how much buffer they have. Savings become insulation. One emergency becomes manageable for one person and devastating for another. These differences are invisible from the outside, but they shape everything. Those with buffers absorb shocks. Those without internalize them. Over time, this creates invisible social divides. People stop comparing themselves to others because comparison feels painful. Instead, they focus on survival metrics. Can I pay this bill? Can I avoid debt this month? Can I keep things from getting worse? Life narrows into maintenance. The system doesn't collapse under this pressure. It adjusts. It becomes leaner, more efficient, and more extractive. Risk is transferred downward. Stability is privatized. Institutions remain profitable while individuals absorb volatility. Healthcare risk becomes personal. Housing risk becomes personal. Employment risk becomes personal. Retirement risk becomes personal. The system still functions, but it no longer protects. This arrangement is stable in the short term. In the long term, it erodes trust beyond repair. People begin to feel like the system doesn't exist to support life, but to process it. They comply because they must, not because they believe in it. Civic engagement declines, not out of apathy, but exhaustion. People don't disengage because they don't care. They disengage because caring hasn't produced results. Participation feels symbolic. Survival feels urgent. This is how belief disappears, not in protest, not in collapse, but in quiet resignation. People stop expecting improvement. They stop expecting fairness. They stop expecting stability to return. They adjust their lives to operate under permanent uncertainty. This does not produce visible failure. It produces stagnation. Innovation slows because risk feels too costly. Entrepreneurship declines because failure feels unforgiving. Creativity narrows because experimentation feels irresponsible. A society in survival mode cannot imagine boldly, and imagination is the engine of progress. The most concerning part of this new reality is how difficult it is to reverse. Economic conditions can improve, but belief does not automatically follow. Once people learn to expect instability, they carry that expectation forward. They don't rush back into risk. They don't rebuild trust easily. They don't expand their lives overnight. The damage lingers. This is why the new reality of living in America isn't just about prices or wages. It's about psychology, about what people expect from life, from work, from each other. When expectations collapse, societies don't break. They shrink. People still live, they still work, they still participate, but with less optimism, less energy, less sense of shared future, the system continues. Hollowed out. This is what makes the moment so difficult to address. There is no single policy fix, no immediate solution, no clear villain. The problem isn't malfunction, it's design. A system optimized for efficiency, profitability, and resilience at the top, while transferring instability downward, will always produce this outcome eventually. And once enough people experience it, it becomes the accepted baseline. The new reality of living in America isn't that people are failing. It's that the definition of success has quietly shifted, from progress to endurance, from building a life to managing pressure, from believing in the future to navigating the present. Most people don't want to admit this, not because it isn't true, but because admitting it would force a reckoning with how much has changed, and how little of that change feels temporary. This is the reality people sense every day, but rarely name. Not collapse, not crisis, but a slow narrowing of what life is allowed to be. And once that narrowing becomes normal, it defines a generation.